Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Rebecca Rubin. I'm a film reporter at Variety, and I am delighted to be joined by Nyle DiMarco, the co-director of Deaf President Now.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for anyone who has not had the pleasure of seeing Deaf President Now, can you just tell us a little bit about the backstory and how you became involved with the film?
Yeah, totally. So in short, the story of Deaf President Now is one of the most iconic civil rights movements, actually, that happened here in the United States. At the world's only university for the deaf, I'm actually an alum. The university is called Gallaudet, and it happened in 1988. At the time, the university had 124 years of leadership of hearing presidents. And at the point of the protest, students had been rallying for a deaf president for years to see more representation of the student body that really came from the community. I'll tell you, myself, I come from an entirely deaf family. I'm fourth generation. So my two brothers, parents, grandparents, very Italian great-grandparents are all deaf. And I'm very, very fortunate that though that history wasn't written or really an oral history, it was really passed down hand to hand throughout generations. And it's wild because it does have so much value to America, right? A lot happened because of the 1988 protests, which really brought me to making the film.
Why do you think that these protests are not more widely taught in school curriculums?
I think, if you look back at history, we tend to repeat ourselves, whether it's minorities or underrepresented groups, they tend to be erased. Deaf and disabled history has really been written out of a lot of textbooks, I think because people don't value our stories. Even though there are so many instances of the deaf and disabled community really contributing to society and really improving our daily lives. I think it's sort of the silver lining is that I have opportunities now to be able to tell those stories in a different way.
So how did you get involved? Is this a project that you brought to producers? Did producers come to you? And why was it important for you to be a co-director on this film?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I developed the idea, and initially I had approached Jonathan King over at Concordia Studios, he was there at the time, about doing this. And I pitched the idea in a scripted format. And he was shocked because he loved the idea, but he really couldn't believe that no one knew about the story. And so we proceeded to work on it as a scripted version. And after the first couple passes of revisions, we weren't satisfied. And it's tough because it's impossible to encapsulate all that Deaf President as a movement was. This wasn't just something that happened within the span of 1 week, right? This carried so much context of years and years of oppression and generational trauma that were really important to pay respect to, which is when I got in touch with Davis Guggenheim, and we were talking about the potential of him directing it as a script and sort of what direction we could take it. And he said, no, this has got to be a documentary. And I was like, oh, of course. It would be so much better off as a doc. It was a real sort of aha moment for me. And at that point, Davis really wanted to, I think, stay true to the theme of Deaf President Now and paying homage with this film by allowing deaf people to lead in the stories that are told about them. And that was so incredible. I really wanted to really serve it and respect the movement as much as possible. But stepping into the directorial role was very different. I had done 2 other documentaries before, but I had never directed. And, Davis, with 30 years of experience, had never co-directed. So I was very, very grateful that I was invited to do it, and also incredibly grateful for Apple's support. Being able to direct is one thing, but also Apple championed this film by allowing us to bring over 40 deaf people across departments in the production, which has never been done before. So I feel very blessed.
That's amazing. It's so interesting to picture it as a scripted project, but if it wasn't a documentary, we wouldn't have gotten to know the real Gallaudet 4, who you interviewed for this film, the leaders of this protest, and they're such fun characters to get to know. What was your process like in meeting them and getting to interview them?
That's another great question. So the benefit of coming from a deaf family and being in the community is that I knew 2 of them quite well. They're family friends. And the other 2 I was excited to approach. When we first met with them about doing the documentary, they said, well, do you know that we've been approached by multitudes of production companies in the past, but every time they were quite hesitant. Over the last 35 years, everyone who's approached them has been hearing. And they didn't want to give away this special story, this important history, to be developed by folks who probably would get it wrong. And I myself, when I was growing up, I remember seeing so many deaf characters, and any sort of reflection in media of the deaf experience was just inauthentic. It was very two-dimensional. You can tell that it was written by a hearing person. So their first question was, are you going to direct it? Are you going to lead it? And they were on from day one. So we had to do a preliminary interview with them and just get some of the basics, and wanted to get a better understanding of what sort of happened throughout that week. And I said, did you all get along? What were your internal conflicts? What was the drama? And they said, oh, no. We had no conflicts. There was no drama. We loved each other. It was amazing. Every day was harmonious. And I'm like, that's not a film, right? Like, that doesn't make a movie. So, in talking to Davis, we decided we would be better off if we split them up and took them one-on-one. And that was when the truth really came out. But, it really brought the story to life having them there.
Definitely. How did you strike the balance in making the film for both hearing audiences and deaf audiences? That the use of silence is really striking in the film.
Yeah, it was a really unique challenge, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced as a director. When we began the process of co-directing, I had pitched the idea to Davis of a deaf POV, where we would weave in scenes that would really throw a hearing audience member into the deaf experience, but also wanted to play up the idea of visual noise, which is a new concept, but essentially it's the idea of showing noise in a visual way, because one of the biggest misconceptions that hearing people have about deaf people is that because we can't hear, we don't have any relationship to sound or noise, which couldn't be any more false. So we wanted to put in moments, essentially, where people would see that. And when I pitched it to Davis, he was excited to play around with it and to really just experiment with the sound design, the removal of sound, as well as the addition and amplification in some places. And, it took us a while, really, to figure out exactly what the deaf POV and the reenactments would look like. In concept, we had a lot of different ideas. And there were so many things within the film that we wanted to mix in, and that was one of the, as I mentioned, unique challenges. But it was really interesting, the dynamic between Davis and I, because I was able to teach him so much about the deaf experience and essentially what that should look like in a cinematic form. And in turn, Davis was able to teach me so much about the hearing experience, how you in the audience would essentially take in the film and how you would experience it. And we were such a great team, truly. But as well, I have to mention Michael Hart, who is a genius editor who worked with us.
You mentioned you had been part of other documentaries before, but this is your first time directing. Was there anything that surprised you about the experience, or anything you weren't expecting going in that you learned as a director?
I grew up aware of the Deaf President Now story. It's something that's really core to our community and our culture. And I wanted really to please our community in bringing this. I wanted to show as many of the critical aspects as we could within the story, but at the same time, as a director, you have to swallow a big pill, which is that everything you do must be in service to a beautiful film. And even though you want those things in it, sometimes they just don't work. And so, you have to sort of find these gems that, you can polish and really highlight their shine. And I'm very, very relieved that, the deaf community has given us such a warm reception and have been so excited. Of course, I wish I could have included so many other things and other key players, but perhaps there'll be another episode or another film.
So Gallaudet has had a deaf president ever since this, and I'm curious how that has shaped the university since then.
Yeah. The biggest concern, that the university had and the board had about a deaf president was their ability to interface with Congress, because it's their job to secure that funding and those endowments. And when we won, right, and we were able to appoint our first deaf president, it was incredible because he broke records. He was able to bring in $180 million of endowments during his time serving the university. And I think that really shows the power, certainly of having representation that's authentic and leading at the forefront. And so everything worked out really beautiful. The campus has now expanded, the student body has now expanded, really Gallaudet has become a mecca, it's become a home. It's funny, I oftentimes call it the Hogwarts of the deaf community.
Why was the 1998 election such an inflection point for the school and the university?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes with a lot of context. So in 1988, we had 3 overqualified candidates coming to the board process. 2 of them were deaf, and as I mentioned, overqualified, and 1 was hearing. Now, these 2 deaf candidates both carried PhDs, had incredible relevant work experience, and just based on sort of the math, the chances that we would win were much higher. And at the same time, on Gallaudet, students had been hosting rallies and big movements to try to communicate to the board exactly what they wanted. And it was to have a deaf president from the community. And also, we were showing them that we were ready. And unfortunately, all of the board members, except for 2, were hearing. We only had 2 deaf people representing the entire university. And they were making decisions, essentially, for us. And they ended up appointing a hearing president initially, and they were going to announce it at the gym, who the next president was. And so when all the students were gathered, instead of actually showing up, they sent a janitor with a box of leaflets to drop it on the floor. And when students found out they had a hearing president, I think it just really, that box was the spark that ignited the flame and started the movement.
Wow, and what did you learn about their protest style, and do you feel like that was one of the things that was effective in actually inspiring change?
Yeah. One thing that really struck me, and I've always found really interesting, and during the protest, you have these 4 student leaders, right? And in the beginning, they didn't get along. You have one character who loathes the other. You have another one with, very different priorities. You have one female student leader who is, prioritizing feminism, right? And keep in mind, out of those 3 candidates, the hearing one was a female. And so, of course, she was supposed to be excited that it was a female president for the first time, but they weren't deaf. And so there were a lot of complexities to, identity and how she sort of related to the decision. But in just that 1 week, those students quickly overcame their differences and their differences of opinion and work together in search of a bigger solution to really speak truth to power. And I think that's very, very, very reflective of what we're seeing today with protests and the current political landscape. We have, I think, a lot of infighting and a lot of conflict that we just seem to not be able to see through and find the human being on the other side. And I really hope that in protesting that we're working together and collaborating. I would hope that this film would inspire hope and to show people that beyond our differences, we can come together for collective action and it can succeed.
So you are the first deaf director to be nominated for an Emmy, which is an incredible accomplishment. What does that mean to you?
I mean, I've been in this industry for a long time, and 10 years ago, there were no deaf producers or writers or directors. And it's so amazing to now be working over the last 10 years to build this pool of incredible creative talent, and as well to be able to share my stories. But to be nominated for an Emmy really, for me, more than anything, confirmed that audiences are ready for our stories and that they're ready for authentic stories told by the people that they're about. And so I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful for the community, the deaf community support.
And what kind of progress are you hoping comes out of this film's success?
I think, not just this film, but, it's interesting. Over the last few years, we're seeing many deaf films make their way to the screen across scripted versions and documentary formats, as well as more disability representation in general. So I think we are moving in the right direction, and it seems that we've taken what could have been a moment and turned it into a movement. And I really would hope that this isn't the end of it, that we look forward for the next 5 years, and we see every single year that we're growing and building and moving forward.
And hopefully schools start to teach this in the curriculum as well, and people get to know the story both through the documentary but also in school.
Absolutely. It would be really nice. Funny actually, I went to deaf schools, my entire academic career, but in 5th grade I went to a public school briefly, and we were learning about all sorts of civil rights movements, and I just kept waiting for the teacher to bring up the chapter about Deaf President Now. And keep in mind, Deaf President Now and its success is what gave rise to the passage of the ADA. It's landmark legislation that in fact protects over 25% of Americans. So it's very key history, and people don't know where that came from or how that came to be. And in 5th grade, I remember thinking, oh, I don't belong here. I don't belong in this society. And I'm hoping that this film essentially is what will cement this into curriculums and will allow students to learn, this came from the community and it's important. As well, I think it's important to instill in them that we're the same.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was so great to chat with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And you've been great. Thank you.